Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So, you might remember that last episode I talked about how one of the main themes of this series, existential alienation, or if you like, self dividedness, runs through Plato's dialogues, even if only in the background sometimes. And it's one of the things that makes them so engaging and so relevant to us today. As I've mentioned, I think Plato worked out a powerful solution to this universal problem. And I'll be getting to that in upcoming episodes. But today I'd like to talk about Plato in really quite a different way. I think it's quite possible to read Plato, especially if you read certain works in isolation from the rest, and come away with a certain sense of melancholy, a sense that he was never really able to heal this universal wound of self-division that concerned him so deeply. I think some important thinkers have come away from Plato with this very conviction, which probably explains, to a great extent, I think, why his potential to help us live better lives has gone mostly untapped in our time. You might remember a couple of episodes ago I talked about how this problem seemed resolved and yet not really resolved in this play by Euripides, the Bacchae, in which the god Dionysus represents something a bit like the id of Freud, that craving for the ecstatic that sometimes seems like a blind, irrational other to the I, the reasoning ego. And the play ends with the ego, if you will, and Dionysus not really reconciled to one another. The frightful power of the god is depicted as something that the reasoning ego must submit to or at least make room for, more or less unquestioningly, because this is what tradition says. To most of us today, this seems to fall short of what it would be like to have a truly harmonious psyche, to be in harmony with oneself and thereby with the cosmos. I think these two always go together, really, since it's through the natural part of the self that we perceive the outside world. So anytime we're attuned with ourselves, I think we're likely to feel attuned with the cosmos. Anyway, you might find that reading Plato gives you a similar sense of failure to really resolve, almost tragic failure to really resolve this fundamental human problem. Though his attempt really comes down on the other side, on the side of the reasoning self or ego. A recurrent theme in his best known book, The Republic, is that reason should rule the other aspects of the self. As we saw last time, he believes the biggest threat to humanity, both individually and communally, is the overturning of the reason by what he calls the lower parts of the soul, the spirited and appetitive elements, these sides that are most closely connected to nature and the body. To repeat one of the passages we quoted from Plato last time, if the whole psyche follows the wisdom-loving part, and there is no internal dissension, then each part will be able to fulfill its own task and be just in other respects. And also, each will reap its own pleasures, the best and the truest, as far as possible. But when one of the other parts rules in the soul to any extent, it cannot find its own pleasure, and it compels the other parts to pursue a pleasure that is alien to them and false. That's from toward the end of the Republic. What it comes down to for Plato is that governance by or influence over the mind by these psychic elements that are closely connected with the body is not likely to end well, because the body hinders us from getting at the truth. This is a dominant theme in Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue that is supposedly relates the last conversation Socrates has with his friends as he's about to drink the hemlock that he's been ordered to take as punishment for corrupting youth and introducing new gods. And it also relates his actual taking of the poison and his death. But anyway, at one point in the dialogue, Socrates argues, so long as we keep to the body and our soul is contaminated with this imperfection, there's no chance of our ever attaining satisfactorily to our object, which we assert to be truth. In the first place, the body provides us with innumerable distraction in the pursuit of our necessary sustenance, and any diseases which attack us hinder our quest for reality. Besides, the body fills us with loves and desires and fears and all sorts of fancies and a great deal of nonsense, with the result that we literally never get an opportunity to think at all about anything. Wars and revolutions and battles are due simply and solely to the body and its desires. All wars are undertaken for the acquisition of wealth. And the reason why we have to acquire wealth is the body, because we are slaves in its service. That is why on all these accounts we have so little time for philosophy. Worst of all, if we do obtain any leisure from the body's claims and turn to some line of inquiry, the body intrudes once more into our investigations, interrupting, disturbing, distracting, and preventing us from getting a glimpse of the truth. We are in fact convinced that if we are ever to have pure knowledge of anything, we must get rid of the body and contemplate things by themselves with the soul or psyche in itself. It seems, to judge from the argument, that the wisdom which we desire and upon which we profess to have set our hearts will be attainable only when we are dead and not in our lifetime. If no pure knowledge is possible in the company of the body, then either it is totally impossible to acquire knowledge, or it is only possible after death, because it is only then that the soul will be separate and independent of the body. It seems so long as we are alive, we shall continue closest to knowledge if we avoid as much as we can all contact and association with the body, except when they are absolutely necessary, and instead of allowing ourselves to become infected with its nature, purify ourselves from it until the God himself gives us deliverance. In this way, by keeping ourselves uncontaminated by the follies of the body, we shall probably reach the company of others like ourselves and gain direct knowledge of all that is pure and uncontaminated, that is, presumably of truth. For one who is not pure himself, to attain to the realm of purity would no doubt be a breach of universal justice. So we have here what seems to be quite an otherworldly, ascetic take on reality. It's tempting to conclude from all this that for Plato, death, which he seems to believe involves the survival of the psyche in some way that is separate from the body, is preferable to life, which is, of course, a deeply melancholy thought. And Plato's ethics can seem to be anti-life in a way, in that this idea of the rule of reason can seem inherently repressive of the natural in us, the id, if you like, or the Dionysian, that craves the ecstatic, that experience of the fullness of life. And one of the most important thinkers of modern times concluded this about him also. In his Twilight of the Idols, published in 1889, it was the same year that he suffered a mental breakdown, actually, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche argued that this anti-life attitude permeated Christianity. He argues that it's possible to spiritualize the passions so that they're wedded with the spirit, as he puts it, But this isn't the way contemporary European morality based on Christianity works for Nietzsche. He writes, "The church combats the passions with excision in every sense of the word. Its practice, its cure, is castration. It never asks, how can one spiritualize, beautify, deify a desire? It has at all times laid the emphasis of its discipline on extirpation of sensuality, of pride, of lust for power, of avarice, of revengefulness. But to attack the passions at their roots means to attack life at its roots. The practice of the church is hostile to life." But Christianity, he writes, was influenced enormously by Plato, who shares this anti-life view, this view in which, for Nietzsche, morality crushes life. He writes later in the same book, "Plato is boring. Ultimately, my mistrust of Plato extends to the very bottom of him. I find him deviated so far from all the fundamental instincts of the Hellenes, so morally infected, so much an antecedent Christian, that I should prefer to describe the entire phenomenon, Plato, by the harsh term higher swindle. In the great fatality of Christianity, Plato is that ambiguity and fascination called the ideal, which made it possible for the nobler natures of antiquity to misunderstand themselves and to step onto the bridge which led to the cross. And how much there still is of Plato in the concept church, the structure, system, practice of the church." There's somebody else I want to mention in this connection because I find him interesting. It's Jonathan Lear, an American scholar who brings a really interesting perspective to bear on this question because he's a professor of ancient philosophy as well as a trained psychoanalyst. What I like about Lear's take on Plato's view here, Plato's ethics, though it also involves psychology and anthropology. They didn't have these names in Plato's time, but and he's not these disciplines aren't being carried out as they are today with empirical science, but that's what he's looking at. He's looking at the psyche and he's looking at human nature. And for Plato, these are all related: psychology, ethics, anthropology, quite intimately. Anyway, I think Lear, looking at all this, isolates the problem in a more precise way than Nietzsche, and in a way that doesn't involve the abandonment of morality, or at least conventional Western morality. In his book on Freud, which I found a really wonderful introduction to Freud, by the way, Lear critiques Platonic and Aristotelian ethics. He agrees with them in that he believes that being good seems related to overcoming self-alienation or self-division, or as he puts it, that ethical life, when properly lived, can be the expression of a genuinely unified, integrated, harmonious psyche. But he questions the means both these philosophers seem to prescribe for people to attain this goal, that the non-rational parts of the psyche must obey reason. Lear asks whether obedience is really what true psychic harmony, or a living psychic unity, you could say, is about. I like this critique because this concept of obedience just seems to get more problematic the more you look into it. I think, like this, the way that the Dionysus and the Dionysian, the solution in the Bacchae, the problem here, and I think Lear is getting at it, is that really with both that and with this idea of obedience, we're talking about metaphors. These are metaphors for what's going on in the psyche, and all metaphors can only go so far. They can only be so useful. The non-rational element of the psyche seems essentially passive in a way. It perceives, it takes stuff in, either from the outer world or from our own bodies. We simply feel what we feel. The parts or elements, if you like, in us that perceive, of course, aren't capable of making their own decisions. So it can't really be a matter of obedience, of these parts deciding to obey. But if so, it's hard to see what this metaphor means, really. If not, that the mind must act indifferently to the irrational. I don't know where else you could take this metaphor, other than just an indifference of the mind to our feelings. That seems like building a wall between them and the furthest thing from psychic harmony. So I think this is a pretty serious critique. Lear thinks Freud was the answer, and I think his explanation for that is pretty fascinating and useful. But as I've touched on in an earlier episode, I also don't believe Freud, psychoanalysis, or even psychotherapy, broadly speaking, are quite enough, science, broadly speaking, quite enough to restore us to the harmony and fullness of life we crave. I also, by the way, see in Socrates' life of intense questioning, and even in the way he died, an intense love for life. And I see Plato inspired by this, and impassioned by glimpses he had of an infinite richness of existence. I think there's another, truer way to read Plato, one that leaves us with a deep hope rather than a sense of melancholy. And I'll be talking about that in upcoming episodes. In fact, in case you haven't guessed it, it's really the theme of this entire series. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.